Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage, and we're back for another edition of Thyroid Answers Podcast. And today I have our kind of new fill-in co-host, Dr. Kelly Halderman. Kelly, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. Today is a great day. We're marching here into spring. It's getting warmer out. We're busting the flip-flops out up here in Minnesota because we hit 40. So, I mean, I can't complain. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Summer's an attitude, not a season, right? So
Oh,
flip-flops,
right.
I guess you could do those almost any time.
Right on.
I'm more of a sandal guy, I guess,
Sure.
versus the flip-flop. But if it's appropriate. Today, though, bitterly cold here in Windy.
No.
Yeah. But we're looking forward to some heat and warmth. But we're going to warm things up a little bit today because we got a topic today. I did a post recently on hypothyroid patterns in labs, right? And so we talk about in our upcoming book, The Thyroid Debacle, and Dr. Erica and I have talked about tissue and cellular hypothyroidism on almost every podcast that we've done so far. But the question becomes from people like, I have chronic hypothyroid symptoms, but my doctor says my labs are normal, right? And so people are like, I guess I don't. If my TSH is normal, maybe I don't have a thyroid problem.
It's super frustrating, and I feel like it's not getting any better. I mean, how long has this podcast been around, the Thyroid Answers, and we're still just an epidemic of this. And so again, this is gonna be super important when we go into these patterns, and this is going to kind of explain. So, share with your providers too, this podcast and this information, because soon we're going to have this in a book in our hands very soon, The Thyroid Debacle in our hands. But yeah, I totally agree with you, Eric. There's a lot of people out there struggling, and I was one of them, where my labs were normalized with medication, but I felt like garbage. So
yeah, so I kind of did a post, and I said, hey, there's when I look at a comprehensive blood chemistry panel, and you as well, there's at least 6 what I call tissue hypothyroid patterns or cellular hypothyroid patterns that would indicate that there's a level of hypothyroidism in tissues and sometimes in specific tissues. That's one of those things that's really important to understand too, that 2 people could have a thyroid physiology problem and have totally different symptoms. You look at the list of all the symptoms, and you'd say, well, I don't have them all. Well, you may not have them all because some of your tissues may be in a significantly hypothyroid state. Some may be in a mildly hypothyroid state, and some may not be in a hypothyroid state at all, and some might be in a hyperthyroid state, right?
Not to go down a rabbit hole, but this topic, I think we should kind of stop here for just a second. Do you have a good explanation as to why I would experience hair loss and hoarseness in my voice, and someone else has completely different manifestation of their symptoms? Do you have a good kind of idea of?
Yeah, I do. And the issue comes down to what we talk about quite a bit, and that's the cell danger response. So depending on which cells and tissues are being impacted by a cell danger response, those are the tissues that are likely going to have local deactivation of thyroid hormone to a greater degree than tissues that maybe aren't in a cell danger response. So not all the tissues of the body have the same level of a cell danger response going on all the time. At some point in time, when the gland becomes exhausted and there's not enough thyroid hormone being produced, that there may be like everything's being impacted, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you have hypothyroid symptoms that all the tissues are going to be impacted evenly. And the cells in each tissue can have a different concentration or types of thyroid transporters that allow for thyroid hormone to get into the tissue. They can have different types and concentrations of the deiodinase enzymes. So those are the enzymes that either activate or deactivate thyroid hormone. And they can have different types and concentrations of thyroid receptors. And so that the transporters, deiodinase concentrations, and receptors can differentiate how a tissue is impacted more strongly, less strongly by a hypothyroid state.
And kind of an example of that, I think in your Instagram post this week, you talked about receptors for bile acids, I believe, and how not every tissue has a receptor for the bile acids, correct?
Right. So there's individual things that can increase the signaling or the conversion of T4 to T3 that has, that changes things other than what's necessarily happening inside the cell too, right? And when you talk about that with bile receptors, if it binds to receptors on the outside of the cell, these things called TGR5 receptors, you're going to get increased conversion of T4 to T3. And so, bile becomes critically important in thyroid hormone signaling. So, we talk about gallbladder things.
We're going to fix it by shoving a bunch of ox bile at them. That's how we're going to.
Right. Hey, right? And it could be good. Or it could be problematic. And, there's people who take ox bile, and if they're in a hypothyroid state, and that could be helpful, right? So it could be helpful if they take a whole bunch of ox bile and they have a lot of that in the system. It could also induce hyperthyroidism in specific tissues. And I know that because I did that to somebody by accident. Yeah. So, when somebody says to you, listen, is it possible that I could be hyperthyroid or my hair's falling out because of this supplement? I was like, no, of course not. And then you look at it and you go, okay, what does ox bile have in relationship to hair? And then you see it really, that converts T4 to T3. I'm inducing a hyperthyroid state in some of these tissues. That was probably not a good idea.
Right. Even nutraceuticals and supplementation, we're all in different stages, and we just have to be careful. Like it's not, more is not, oh gosh, today I had a consult and I was like, more is not better. Okay. I mean, like, let's drive that home most of the time. I mean, more love, that's better. But I mean, supplementation and, putting more thyroid hormone in the system, we were talking about before we started this, to make numbers normalize, not the best strategy, right? So
yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing we talk about on the podcast. It's the biggest thing we talk about in the book is that we have to ask better questions. Why is the body doing this? Instead of always leaping to the conclusion that the body's just broken and doesn't know what the heck it's doing, instead we should step back and say, you know what? Why would the body want to slow down metabolism? Is there potentially a reason here that this may be going on? We're very, very quick to consider that the body's just stupid, doesn't know what it's doing. And somehow, somehow we got here from 2 cells, right? Became this. And so somehow we lost all this wisdom. And so I'm not buying it, right? So anyway, let's talk about when somebody has hypothyroid symptoms, but they're told that their thyroid physiology is normal. So this relates to somebody who has not been diagnosed with a thyroid condition, just goes to their primary care, and the standard role, we both understand where allopathic medicine is coming from. The standard role for an allopathic physician, if they're considering a thyroid issue, is like a TSH with reflex to T4 panel, right? And you know this because this is your up your alley with your medical background. And people get concerned. They say, why would my doctor not run more? Part of the reason is all the guidelines, and you talk about this in the book, the guidelines state TSH is kind of this screening test. If it's within range, nothing else needs to be done. And if it's out of range, then the lab kind of automatically runs a free T4 level, right? So if you've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism, put on meds and your TSH and T4 normalize, this applies. If you have been told you don't have a thyroid problem because your TSH is normal and that's all that you've ever done, this still applies, right? So I said there's about 6 patterns. There's actually more, but I only put down 6 for that Instagram post. And then we'll talk about all those because there's plenty to talk about with just those 6. So one of the first things that I take a look at from a thyroid panel perspective, the thing I wanted to look at, somebody says, I think I have thyroid issues. I run a comprehensive blood chemistry panel. My comprehensive panel is about 65, 66 tests. but it includes a comprehensive thyroid panel: TSH, T4, T3, free T4, free T3, reverse T3, T3 uptake, thyroid antibodies, and I don't know, a couple more. But anyway, I want to take a look at that. And so what tests would I look at to say, does this person potentially have a cellular or tissue hypothyroid state, which may be the reason why they have their chronic hypothyroid symptoms? I'm going to look at the, what's T3 look like, what's reverse T3 look like, and what's the ratios of T3 to reverse T3 and free T3 to reverse T3. And so if I see that a person's got normal TSH, T4, but their T3 or free T3 levels are low, then we know there's reduced conversion of T4 to T3. And because there's a biologic priority to maintain T3 levels in the bloodstream, we would say that there's likely a tissue hypothyroid state as well. So I look at those two values. I also look at what's reverse T3. So we talk about T4 as the primary hormone that's either provided in medication or the primary thyroid hormone that's made by the thyroid gland. It's in the bloodstream. It's kind of the circulating reserve, always circulating, always ready. Like, hey, if you need me, I'm here. But that T4 can either be activated, converted to T3, or it can be deactivated to reverse T3. So I want to know, what's the body favoring? Is it favoring that conversion of T4 to T3, or is it favoring that conversion to reverse T3? So if I see an elevation of reverse T3 and a drop off of T3, it becomes pretty evident that the body's favoring that increased deactivation. Your thoughts?
My thoughts are exactly those, and that I would add to that, and we share the same sentiment, that that's not a mistake either. Deactivating that thyroid hormone, sending it to reverse, is not a mistake. There's something going on, and it's our job as clinicians, it's our job as practitioners to find out what that is.
Yeah. So, and we talk about this in the book too, and we say, why would the body do this? And part of the reason is, from my perspective, and you can add in and jump in if you want, but the cells are typically in like one of two states, right? They're either in growth and development mode, or they're in cell defense mode, right? And if I'm in growth and development mode, I want to convert T4 to T3 because that drives the metabolism that grows. I make proteins, I make enzymes, I make hormones, I make all this great stuff, cell membranes, all the stuff that T3 helps drive, energy. And when I have T3 binding to receptors that drive that metabolism, that actions occur. I can also have T3 binding to receptors that turns processes off. And the processes that are often turned off by T3 binding are a lot of the cell danger, inflammatory mechanisms, the cell defense mechanisms are turned off by T3 binding inside the cell. So lots of T3 inside the cell, nuclear stimulation, mitochondrial stimulation, and turn off that cell stress response. But if I'm in danger mode, if I'm a cell in danger mode, I want to turn off growth and development. I don't want to make more proteins for this threat. I don't want to bring more glucose in so that this threat can use it. I want to decrease the amount of T3 so I have less T3 to bind to those receptors of metabolism, and I have less T3 turning off the cell stress response. And by having less T3 binding to those receptors, I actually turn on or support that cell danger response.
Right now, in my mind, I think of the times that I chose to switch someone from Synthroid because it wasn't working to Cytomel to T3 only. And it's like, what you just explained, Dr. Eric, I was literally overriding the body's innate intelligence, and nobody ever really felt better on the T3. But as a listener, can you just hear in that mechanism what the body's trying to do, what the intelligence of the cell danger response is turned on, your body can be shunting, making more reverse T3 to protect you. But then we shove in a bunch of a T3 extraneously. What's going to happen? This is not a natural process. We're actually interfering. So
yeah, and I think part of that that's really important is that in the short run, you do hear people say, wow, I feel better. And then all of a sudden they're like, but now I'm not feeling so good. Now I'm anxious, I'm edgy, I can't sleep, I have insomnia. And you know what? Now I'm starting to gain some, initially I thought I lost some weight, but now I'm starting to gain weight. What's going on here, right?
Yeah, right.
And so I mean, because I get a lot of comments and I talk to a lot of people that initially they have that honeymoon period where they feel better,
Yeah.
but we get that when you give T4 and you haven't had it. We get that when you get Armor and you haven't had T3, right? If your body's not making T3, and why does that happen? Because now all of a sudden T3 has it's a less cost-effective process to get T3 into a cell than it is T4. Sure. And so you can get it across, it's ready to go. And some tissues that really need it, it's there. But again, you still have more T3 in the system that the body's trying to get rid of. So in many cases, and I'm biased because of the population I see, but in most of those people that have switched to adding T3 to normalize the blood, the same thing happens. They have their honeymoon period and then they start feeling bad again, but now they have mixed hyperthyroid symptoms, and they started at 5 micrograms and now they're at 10 micrograms and now they're at 15 micrograms and now they're at 20 micrograms. And they're like, what's going on? It's the same mechanism that was going on. The body is trying to slow down the metabolism, right?
Right.
So that's the first thing I want to look at is the rest of the thyroid panel and say, do we have a thyroid panel that kind of indicates this? And if we do, then I want to look at the rest of the panel for patterns. And I talked about 5 patterns on there, and I'm cheating because I'm just looking at the board because I wrote them up the other day. But I talk about a dysglycemia pattern that we can talk about, like what happens with blood sugar regulation. There's a dyslipidemia pattern, and primarily I'm talking about the elevation of cholesterol and LDL with that pattern. I talk about the fatty liver pattern, which is still going to be LDL and cholesterol, but now I'm adding in triglycerides and VLDL as well, and the liver enzymes potentially. And then the inflammatory pattern where, hey, why is this occurring? So we'll talk about that. And then the last pattern I put for that post is like the renal pattern, right? And there are more patterns, right? These are the biggies. So which one do you think we should start with?
Let's start from the top. Let's work our way down.
So for me, the dysglycemia pattern becomes like a gimme, right? Because, and people would say like, no, you just have insulin resistance. It's not a thyroid, doesn't have anything to do with thyroid, right? You haven't right? It's that you're eating too much carbohydrates, you're not exercising enough, it's your diet. That's why you have this diabetic condition going on. And the reality is that no, you almost have to have a tissue hypothyroid problem going on to be insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, and diabetic. And we're talking primarily like type 2, right?
Right.
But why would that occur? And the reason is glucose needs to come into a cell via what we call transporters. They're called GLUT transporters, GLUT transporters. There's I think 4 or 5 that really are focused on glucose transport specifically, but typically the first 1 through 4 are the biggies, right? And so glucose 4 is the one that requires insulin, right? So that's the insulin dependent. So you eat food, your food comes into your GI tract, it's broken down, it's digested, and you get little glucose molecules as a result of that digestion. When that glucose gets into the bloodstream, it needs to go somewhere, because if the glucose hangs around in your bloodstream, it's like sticky, right?
You create AGEs. Advanced glycosylation end products, which ruin your kidneys, your brain, everything. So we won't go into that, but yes, you don't want excess glucose hanging around. That's how they measure hemoglobin A1C, is because the sugar hooks on to your hemoglobin. It's not supposed to be there. So
yeah, so I mean, think of the sugar like any other sugar, right? If you spill sugar, it gets like sticky and tacky, right? And that's not good. And then other things stick to it. And so as you were talking about with hemoglobin A1C, the longer the red blood cells in the bloodstream, the more chance of some of this stuff can stick to it. But red blood cells lifespan is what, 90, 120 days, something like that, right? And so we know that, hey, if there's less glucose always in the bloodstream, there's going to be less stuff stuck to your red blood cells. So your hemoglobin A1C will be lower. But if you have lots of glucose always in the bloodstream, then there's lots of stuff to stick to your hemoglobin A1C. So your hemoglobin A1C number goes up, and sticky red blood cells, they don't work so good, right?
No, and it hurts your vessels, it hurts your kidneys, it hurts everything. So it's not just like this, this happenstance finding, like we're just looking at sugar that's attached on red blood cells. Like that is very, very dangerous. There's big health consequences to that. So carry on. We don't want the glucose. We want it driving into the cell.
We want it to go into the cell. So what do we need to carry it or escort it into the cell is this thing called insulin, right? So insulin's the escort. It's like a really nice guy opens the door for Kelly to come into the restaurant, whatever. But we want to get glucose out of the bloodstream into the tissues. So we use these glucose transporters, GLUT4 transporters that are insulin dependent, okay? So it just so happens that GLUT4 transporter requires optimal levels of T3 to work appropriately. So if you have low levels of T3, what we call cellular hypothyroidism, or tissue hypothyroidism, we're talking about like a GI tract or a liver, we're talking about the whole organ or a whole tissue, you're going to have a hard time getting glucose into the cell. And so what does your body need to do? Then your body needs to make more insulin, right? To try and jam it into the cells some way. So I always say it's kind of like a party, right? So if it's my house and, I'm having let's say I was in college, I'm having like my little fraternity party, or my rugby buddies are over, we're having a party. What do we want at our party? We want women, right? We want sugar. We want sugar at our party, right?
Bring the candy.
Yeah, bring the candy in. But you know what sugar always brings with her is an escort, because she doesn't want she doesn't want anything happening. So she brings her guy friends from the dorm down, right? And so, they help get them into the party, right? They're not coming in. The problem is, as a cell, right, I don't want too much sugar in the cell, and I don't want too much insulin circulating, because just like a house party, you get too many drunk guys in a house party, it creates problems, right? Yep. So we don't want too much insulin circulating either, and we don't want too many people in the party. So you need optimal levels of T3 to manage appropriately fed glucose levels, right? So when people say, man, my insulin levels are really high, my fasting insulin, that means it's taking a ton of insulin to get sugar that you've eaten from your meal into your cells. Think about it. That means like the house party, that means it's taking like 10 guys from the dorm to jam the door open at my house to allow all these kids to come in and party at my house. Does that make sense? Maybe not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So so then you might say, well, okay, well, what about when I'm not eating and I'm taking my blood sugar, my fasting glucose is high? What's that all about? Well, in a fasted state, you have like 4 hormones that are going to drive up glucose, because you need a certain amount of glucose in your cells, even when you're not eating, right? And so there's cortisol, there's glucagon, there's epinephrine, and what I'm missing one. Glucagon, cortisol, epinephrine. It'll come to me.
Yeah, it'll come to me too. Okay.
Growth hormone. Yeah.
Yes.
So we got 4 hormones that are going to drive this process, right? That increase glucose. So getting glucose, having enough glucose in the bloodstream is critically important. How important? It's so important. There's 4 hormones that actually do it. How many hormones are there to bring down glucose? Only 1. So we do give insulin a hard time, like it's all insulin. It's insulin. Insulin's a problem. Listen, insulin's the only hormone you have to bring glucose down. You got 4 trying to jam it up and raise it all the time. So it is really important to have insulin around. We do need it. And I think the key is we look at the elevated insulin as the bad thing. The elevated insulin really isn't the bad thing either. Yeah, it's the body saying, I don't know what to do with all this sugar. Yeah, I got to force it somewhere, or I'm going to have damaged vessels and damaged organs. I got to get it out of the bloodstream, right? So in a fasted state, you still have glucose being made, right? And it still needs to get into the cells. So how does it get into the cell? Because if we're not eating, we don't get the insulin release. So how is the body getting it into the cell? It's getting into the cell by other types of glucose transporters. Glucose 1 and glucose 3 are two of the primary. There's another one, glucose 2, I'll talk about in a second, but it's these two are like the fasted state glucose transporters. But guess what they need? They need optimal levels of T3 inside the cell. So if you don't have optimal levels of T3 inside your cells, your fasting blood sugar is probably going to be higher. Why? Because when you're stressed, when you wake up, when your cortisol rises, your glucose is going up, and you don't have enough T3 inside the cells to bring it in a fasted state appropriately, right?
Right, exactly.
So there is another glucose transporter we should probably talk about, and that's glucose transporter 2, GLUT2. Now, this transporter is a little bit different because the liver has glucose transporters and glucose transporter 2, and the liver sometimes when the blood sugar is driving low or the body's sensing, hey, I need more sugar, the liver will pump out glucose, right? And it comes out of the liver through this GLUT2 transporter, which guess what it requires?
Thyroid hormone.
It requires thyroid hormone, T3. But somebody might say, yeah, but if it requires T3 and I have a tissue hypothyroid state going on, why, if the other tissues are T3 resistant, they don't have enough T3 and they're glucose resistant, why is the liver able to still make it? Because each of the glucose transporters has a different requirement for how much T3 needs to function well, and different tissues have different systems in place to say, hey, this is a more important thing to get done. We're going to reserve T3 to make sure that the liver has the ability to do it. Right. So every tissue doesn't regulate the same. Now, you might say, all right, well, if I'm tissue resistant to glucose, why am I getting fat, right? Why am I putting on belly fat? Well, one of the reasons is, guess what other cell has glucose 2 transporter, which is one of the transporters that holds on the longest and can work at that lower thyroid hormone state, your adipose tissue, right? So your adipose tissue can hang in there, just like the liver can hang in there and generate and release glucose into the bloodstream. The adipose tissue can suck up a ton of glucose because it has that glucose 2 transporter, okay? So moral of the story is, if you have elevated hemoglobin A1C, you've been told you're pre-diabetic, you're diabetic. If your insulin's elevated, you've been told you're insulin resistant, right? Your fasting blood sugar's high. Guess what? You have a level of tissue hypothyroid going on, right?
Right on.
All right, you think we got that one? That one's good?
Yeah, that's good. You actually personally had that, right? That was your biochemistry there for a while.
Yeah, I mean,
Picture of health having insulin resistance. It's just, there's the mechanism. There it is. You would have never thought it.
Right. And for me, right, I was, I'm doing a lot of the right things, but overtraining, undersleeping, poor respiration from multiple broken noses creates what? Excessive cell stress, right? You say, well, how could exercise cause cell stress? Well, that's part of what exercise does, is cause short-term cell stress so that we can break things break down and then rebuild. Some stress is really important. We call it, there's a hormetic effect. No stress, bad. Good amount of stress, good. Too much stress, danger, right? So we have to balance it. But that's exactly what happened to me. Hey, I'm putting on belly fat. I'm insulin resistant. What is going on here? I'm really not eating that much carbohydrates.
Right? It just doesn't make any sense. But when you hear that mechanism you just went through, it makes complete sense. And I love that it was in someone who looks like you and is so fit, because we think of, insulin resistance, you're not exercising enough and you're consuming too many calories, the same old, but it can happen. It's cellular stress. It's what the body is trying to protect you from, is that excessive stress. So I'm sure you started sleeping better and you're a better breather. And you still probably
well, I'm still wearing the nose thing, and I still do mouth taping because, those are things that help. And I can tell a difference when I do it and when I don't do it, right? So it's, for the cost of buying nasal strips and mouth tape, it's not that big of a deal.
And I think that's why we always say we believe in principles, not protocols, because it's not like, I'm Dr. Eric, I fixed my cellular hypothyroidism by doing X, Y, and Z. I didn't exercise so much. I went to bed and I fixed my breathing. It's like, no. See part 3 of our book on the fitness factors, right? And it's very much the principles behind it. So yes. All right.
Yeah, which is important, right? Because it's like, could this come back again? Yeah. Okay. If I continue to do the things that would create excessive cell stress, I'm going to get the same issues back again. So let's talk about the next pattern, which is this dyslipidemia pattern. So I'm going to go right away. Do I have a person who's got a thyroid issue? What medications are they taking? Are they taking a statin? Right? What's their cholesterol level? So if this is a person who's seeing their cholesterol levels rise, their LDL levels rise, I get the ding, ding, ding going off. We probably have a tissue hypothyroid state starting to occur in the liver. Now, there's always the argument as to what cholesterol and LDL levels should be. I'm not necessarily in the camp that cholesterol needs to be as low as humanly possible, under 200. I'm not in the camp that says LDL should be as low as possible either. Cholesterol is critically important for function, right? Cholesterol is not a bad guy. Oxidized or damaged lipids are bad, right? They don't do us very good. But again, that's the effect caused by some type of inflammatory or free radical damage, right? So sometimes we're blaming the wrong thing. Right. But let's just say that you see an elevation, whether it's a functional elevation. For me, if you're under 60, the literature that I've seen, and maybe you've seen something similar or different, but the literature for optimal health for cholesterol is, the top end is like 240 if you're under 60, and I think it's like 270 for longevity if you're over 60. So, I think we've been told that it needs to be under 200. That hasn't proved to be super beneficial with everybody on statins. I think we're having as many people die, if not more, die with low cholesterol now from cardiovascular disease as high cholesterol. So regardless, if somebody says their labs look like the cholesterol is elevating, LDL is elevating, again, I'm not necessarily worried like, oh my gosh, I got to suppress it. I look at that elevated LDL and cholesterol and say, I probably have a thyroid issue going on, because the liver has these things called LDL receptors, right? And LDL, so let's think about this. So LDL and HDL and VLDL, these are like kind of boats, right? That carry your lipids around the body, carry cholesterol around the body. And they're really important to carry it out to the tissues, bring it back to the liver. But the liver has these things called LDL receptors, so that the boat, LDL, can dock at the liver and dump off the cholesterol, because the cholesterol has an important role in biophysiology, which is like all up in your wheelhouse, right? And so to get that LDL receptor to work, guess what you have to have? You have to have optimal levels of T3 inside the cell for those LDL receptors to work. So if you have elevated cholesterol, if you have elevated LDL, if you've just been told that you just need to take a statin, you should have like alarms going off. I probably have some level of hypothyroidism somewhere on the spectrum. It's either cellular or tissue hypothyroidism. Maybe you're already into a thyroiditis situation, or maybe you're in full out primary hypothyroidism, or maybe you're already in a biochemical euthyroid state where TSH and T4 have been normalized, but you're still not getting enough T3 at the liver. Thoughts on that one?
That's spot on. I mean, that's spot on. That's what I see that all the time. And I see it correct very nicely when we optimize fitness factors, when we start working on root causes.
So when
not using statins.
So the other thing, from a physician standpoint, we've got to be aware, like what medication our patient's taking, because if they're taking a statin already, they may have a cholesterol that's like 130. You may say, well, I don't think they have a tissue hypothyroid issue going on at the liver. Right? Because you're not aware of, oh, wait a minute, that statin is artificially lowering my LDL and my cholesterol. So yes, the value is normal, but it's not appropriate for how my patient feels. And the fact it's being artificially suppressed with the statin. So that's a second pattern that a physician or the individual person can look at. Is my cholesterol LDL elevated, right?
Exactly.
So the third pattern, or the fourth pattern talked about, is like this fatty liver pattern. Okay.
Yeah.
So fatty liver disease has different phases and stages. Okay. So the things I'm going to say here aren't necessarily, this is kind of as it's progressing, because you could have
not in stage, right?
Right. So this is when we see a fatty liver, we're typically going to look for, like, triglycerides are starting to rise, right? You're going to see your VLDL starting to rise. Okay. Cholesterol is probably already going to be elevated from the same mechanism. LDL is going to be elevated. HDL is probably going to be in the tank. And then we may or may not see elevations of what we call the liver enzymes. Really, GGT is the best of the liver enzymes. AST and ALT are kind of just like mitochondrial markers, right?
Yeah, they're non-specific, really.
Yeah. So when we see the key to me that fatty liver is starting to occur is when I see triglycerides and VLDL starting to rise. And how I kind of think about it, and maybe you can jump in and give it a little different take on it. But when somebody's starting to already be glucose resistant, right? Insulin resistant, they still need energy. So the fat cells are starting to release these things called free fatty acids, which is essentially your triglycerides. So they're going to go up. Why is the body doing it? The body's saying, hey, I want to send these triglycerides to the liver so the liver can break that down and utilize it for energy, right? And this is a big idea of why people do higher fat diets, lower carbohydrates. They're trying to get their body to start releasing these fats so that they can actually use those as a fuel. And the body does like to use those as a fuel source. The difference between burning glucose often and burning fat, I always say it's like trying to run your fireplace on newspaper or with wood, right? So if I have to keep crumbling up newspaper and throwing it on there, I'm always paying attention. I always got to feed it. And that's why as a person who's like glucose resistant, insulin resistant, and they're kind of fueling their body on glucose, they're always hungry, right? They're always
hungry, and just the metabolically not fit, right? I can't fast. I get really shaky if I go an hour without food. I'm like, ding, 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 right? Yeah. Like we're starting to look, we got to get more metabolically fit. So yes, I share the same view of what the body's trying to do. And that fatty liver, man, it's becoming an epidemic in of itself. Looking at all the foods that we're eating too, that are driving a lot of fructose, high fructose corn syrup. We could talk about that for a day and how that mechanism works too. But yes, same page.
Yeah. So for the listener, I mean, you have these triglycerides being elevated, you need T3 to kind of support the transport of these things inside to the liver. Okay. Once in the liver's got to be able to burn it, right? You got to have optimal mitochondrial function to burn fats efficiently. It's called beta oxidation. Totally requires T3 to really drive the mitochondrial process. And guess what? If you have tissue hypothyroidism at the liver, you can't burn these fats, right? So triglycerides are going to back up in the bloodstream because they can't get in. Two, the liver's going, okay, I brought this triglyceride in. What am I going to do with it? Or I'm going to put it in storage. I'm going to store it in here. And that becomes your developing fatty liver, right? And at some point, the liver's like, look, I got no more room, right? So I'm going to bring that triglyceride in, nowhere to put it. I'm pushing it right back out. Now it gets bound to the LDL, becomes VLDL. And now that's going to go back and say, okay, I got to go find someplace else in the body for this stuff to get stored, right? Yeah. So if you see that VLDL level going up or that triglyceride level going up, along with cholesterol, LDL, you're already in the fatty liver, right? So you've got this hypothyroid pattern. Now, could TSH still be totally normal? Absolutely, it could be. It absolutely could be.
They're inflamed, which kind of brings us to another topic of
Right. So why is my TSH normal if this is going on? Well, you have inflammatory mechanisms going on. Inflammation is going to increase the conversion of T4 to T3 in the hypothalamus and pituitary. TSH stays low, right?
Why did God do that? I mean, that is so mean, right? I mean, like, of all things, I mean, I get the whole, or why did the universe do that? But it's trickery, because people are like, but my TSH is normal, or the, practitioners, your TSH is normal, and I didn't learn that in medical school. I did not learn what Dr. Eric just said. So yes, that inflammatory pattern. Yep.
So that was our fourth pattern, I think. Yeah, that was the fourth one we talked about. Yep. And then the fifth one is I'm looking for the inflammatory pattern. And technically, I'm almost looking for this one first, because if I have somebody who's got a normal TSH and chronic hypothyroid symptoms, we would say, this is where we kind of talk about in the book this too, like when you interpret labs, you got to interpret them. Is the lab normal and appropriate? The labs are all normal, patient feels great, that's probably appropriate, right? Is a lab value normal and inappropriate? My hair's falling out, my eyebrows are thin, I'm gaining weight, I'm tired, fatigued, I'm constipated. Right. I got all the hypothyroid symptoms, but TSH is normal. Well, maybe it is normal, but it's inappropriate for my patient, right? So that's where we want to say, do I have this tissue hypothyroidism going on? Do I have a pattern, a thyroid pattern that has it? Yes. Is there labs that show me a reason why the body might be having this issue going on? Is there inflammatory markers showing up that would kind of confirm that, yeah, I got increased inflammation. It's going to increase T4 to T3 conversion in the hypothalamus and pituitary. Do I have increased inflammatory markers that are going to drive more deiodinase 3 and increase my reverse T3? And that's where I'm going to look at things like CRP or high sensitivity CRP, homocysteine. I'm going to look for uric acid levels to be elevated. I'm going to look for ferritin to be elevated, increased fibrinogen,
low bilirubin,
and low bilirubin. Exactly. So if I see, and again, it doesn't have to be all of them, right?
Mm-mm.
So if I have 2 or 3, that's a good pattern. I could say, you know what, I probably got an inflammatory process, right? So one test by itself, not a big deal. But if I have a couple, and I have symptoms, and I have the thyroid panel, and I have the cholesterol pattern, and I have the dyslipidemia pattern, right? And I have the blood sugar pattern. Guess what? I probably have cell and tissue hypothyroidism, right?
Yep.
So we're going to talk about one more, and that's the renal pattern. And again, just like and all of these, depending on how early you are into a hypothyroid state, these values could be off, right? If you're just in a tissue hypothyroid state and your gland is still working well, these values could be, we're saying, hey, the value may be elevated, but it also could be low, right? If you have, when we go back to the fatty liver pattern, we talk about triglycerides. If you're early on into maybe a cell or tissue hypothyroid state, you might have low triglycerides because you don't have appropriate T3 supporting bile production, right? And because of that, I can't absorb fats from my diet. So I actually might have lower triglycerides early on. It may not be till I'm more progressed that I actually see the elevations of triglycerides, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, you do a lot of discussion on bile flow, detox 2.5, and T3 hormones critical.
Absolutely.
To every step of bile production, bile flow, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you see like this epidemic of people, getting their gallbladders removed. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, I mean, that's just the natural flow of what's going on here. It's like the end game. It's really sad because that's not going to fix your problem, right? Did not fix my problem, but I digress. So let's go back to the renal stuff, which is really scary because, I was at a lecture and the presenter said that there are more dialysis units per zip code now than Starbucks, or some ridiculous amount. And it is, if you really look, there are dialysis centers on every corner, and this is where this begins, right? And that's where it ends. So let's go into that pattern.
So renal function. When we're taking a look at renal function, one of the big things you can take a look at, there's 3 key tests I think you take a look at, but one that you can take a look at almost right away, and it's not done on every lab, even on a general lab panel that your MD runs, but that's GFR, glomerular filtration rate. And so your kidneys are the big fluid processors in the body, right? So they're constantly filtering and running fluid through and filtering and throwing out the waste products, recycling minerals and bringing things back into the system. So it's critically important to have optimal renal, or what we call kidney function. Guess what plays a role in renal function and renal capacity and renal filtration? That's thyroid hormone. So if you don't have sufficient T3 in those cells or tissues, you're not going to have optimal glomerular filtration. So you're going to have your GFR levels starting to drop. Now, when you look at it, we've got some issues on a lab panel. First of all, you got to run it to know, right? The second thing that's really important is knowing the difference between the disease state, right, and the optimal state. So from my references, I look at over 100 as probably the optimal range for GFR, right?
Yeah,
I see healthy people, healthy kidney function, 100, 120, 130, actually really good filtration. Renal disease will start, you'll see at under, people, the medical community is really starting to get concerned under 60. And I've seen people, the medical community say, hey, there's nothing we're going to do until we get down into the 30s.
I know.
Which is sad, right? Because we're watching this kidneys just get damaged and destroyed to a point that they have to go on dialysis. And that's not a fun life. But if your glomerular filtration rate is under 100, that may be an indication that, hey, there's something going on in the kidneys, and maybe it's another indication that I have suboptimal T3 getting to the kidneys. So the problem is if you don't run it, you don't know. The other issue is on many labs, it's greater than 60, right? That's how, if it's over 60, it's somewhere over 60.
It's like fasting blood sugar less than 100. Oh, you're good. It's like, no, you're not good there.
Yeah. So how that, I mean, it's really important. And I don't have the statistics for renal function, right? Like how much function you've lost when the numbers drop. But I have seen, like it was great little segue there. When you talk about blood sugar numbers, I've seen that your cardiovascular risk, like 82 to 88 is kind of like the optimal fasting blood sugar, given everything else is correct, right? But I think the literature was 89 to 94 is like a 45 or 50% increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and Kaiser Permanente did a study in 2011 and said that for every point above fasting blood glucose of 84 confers a 6% chance that you will be a diabetic within 10 years.
Right.
I mean, so when you're at 99, do the math. I mean, we've talked about that before. It's like, where are you? We're watching the train derail, or we're watching it go down the tracks the wrong way. So this is like the kidney function, right? So I prefer 100. When we see it dropping, we have to get aggressive. Kidney damage is serious stuff. And again, I see all these really, even in healthy people, right? I mean, it's just a canary in the coal mine kind of thing, that you're still peeing, and and your electrolytes are holding, because that's a really big function of your renal system, is to balance your electrolytes, but it's not optimal. It's really not optimal. So this pattern is, I think, really, really important for practitioners to really hone in on, and also a layperson, to ask for these labs.
Yeah, and the challenge is, unless you start to hear these conversations, you're going to assume that as long as it's greater than 60, you're good. When in reality, if you're 61 and optimal is greater than 100, that's like you got a D- on your math test. You didn't do good, right? You passed for today, right? But you didn't do good. So look for your GFR being less than 100. Okay. Now, if everything else is perfect and your GFR is less than 100, maybe not a big deal. Let's retest it again and see what else is going on. Maybe something else is influencing. There's lots of things that may influence it. But again, you start putting lots of these patterns together, and you start to say, you know what, I don't care what that TSH says. I got a thyroid problem going on in my tissues, and I need to figure out why. But to finish this pattern, typically we're going to see is a decreased GFR. That's the number one thing I think to take a look at. The second thing to consider is your BUN. And typically when the renal system is getting very compromised, blood urea nitrogen is going to elevate. Again, early on in a cellular or tissue hypothyroid state, that BUN could be low because you have issues that are impacting protein absorption, right? So if you have
energy production with the creatinine too, yep.
Yeah, so those things could be low early on. So you'd say, well, my GFR is low, but my BUN's low. Right, but you also have low stomach acid caused by potentially low T3 at the stomach. But if you have low protein absorption, then you're not going to have the ammonia being produced by the breakdown of those proteins into amino acids, and therefore that may be lower. But as this gets worse, BUN is going to rise. So for people who don't know what BUN is, blood urea nitrogen is essentially ammonia from the body being converted. So proteins break down and produce ammonia. Bacteria produces ammonia. That ammonia gets to the liver and it gets converted into something called urea. And the liver then pushes it out into the bloodstream as blood urea nitrogen, BUN, right? Now that BUN, blood urea nitrogen, now needs to go to the kidneys and get filtered and cleared out of the system. If your BUN is rising, what that should tell you is I'm either making a ton of ammonia for some reason, or my kidneys are not able to get rid of this stuff because something's up. Is my GFR low? Yeah, it is. Do you have other hypothyroid symptoms? I do. Okay, you probably have tissue hypothyroidism impacting the renal system. Same thing with creatinine. You already mentioned that was a good call there. Creatinine levels, when it gets really bad, are going to tend to be elevated, but early on, they may be low. Why would your creatinine levels be low? Well, you need creatine to make and help with something called ATP production, which is your energy molecule. So when you use that creatine, you get what kind of the waste product is this creatinine. Again, what gets rid of it? The renal system. So if you have this creatinine that can't get cleared by the renal system, it's because the kidneys are in bad shape, it's going to be high. But early on, it could be low because you're not making energy, right? So if you're not making energy, your mitochondria is not working, you're not going to have that much creatinine. So those numbers could be high or low, but the biggie to look at is that GFR, in my opinion.
Right. Agreed.
So for the listener, for just the layperson, these are things that you can see sometimes on your labs that you might be able to see on your own. You go back and you listen to this podcast a couple of times and go look at your lab work and say, okay, but which number, when you're talking high, which number, are you talking about the optimal range? You're talking about the lab reference range? Typically, I'm talking about the lab reference range or the optimal range because we're going to see these patterns faster and sooner. But you still see, if you see this in the lab reference ranges, these patterns, you're further into the process of tissue damage and tissue disease, more than likely.
Right.
So the answer that somebody might say is, well, you keep talking about thyroid hormone at the tissues. It's T3 at the tissues, T3 at the tissues, T3 at the tissues. Why wouldn't we just give them T3? Right. And I think you kind of pointed this out in the beginning, which is if I have plenty of T4 in the bloodstream and the body doesn't want to use it, it probably doesn't want to use the T3 either. Right.
Right. Fix the underlying root cause.
Right.
And I think that's the whole bringing this all together, tied up with a bow, is that all these things mean there's an underlying cause causing cell stress, that allostatic load is too heavy for your body. We got to start picking stuff off, and it is all about optimizing fitness factors. And it is all about, if you're really ill, finding someone to help you get to these really stealth infections and things. When you're just hitting a roadblock, find some help. Find a professional like Dr. Eric or someone who understands this. But don't settle for your labs are normal, you should be fine. Just don't settle for that, or don't settle for, you should eat less, exercise more. There's intricate physiology that's going on here. And we just threw a lot at the listener, so let's kind of let them digest it. But, the book's coming out soon. We'll have that manual in part 3 for, not just how to help your hypothyroidism, but really how to help your entire physiology.
So I think we did a good job, got that done in an hour too, right? So I think that's good. I'm not sure if people are going to be able to listen to that at 1.75 speed or 2.0 speed, like I usually listen to mine. But I think there's good information there. And I think this will help the listener understand why they may not feel good, other things to look at. And hopefully when they are going and they're looking for a functional medicine practitioner, what they're looking for is somebody who's going to break down the labs. And maybe this is the question that they can ask their functional medicine practitioner. Like, when you assess thyroid physiology, what tests do you look at? If they tell you, I just look at a TSH and T4, that's an allostatic approach. I don't care whether you're seeing an allopathic medical physician, an endocrinologist, or a functional medicine practitioner. If those are the only 2 tests, it's an allopathic approach. If they say, I'm looking at just a thyroid panel, again, I'm going to tell you that's an allopathic approach. Which of that little saying that you have is principles, not
protocols.
Not protocols. So, well, I look at I'm better because I look at T4 and T3. Well, I think you're still trying to fix the same thing. You not only need to know what's going on with the thyroid physiology, but you also need to know what's happening in the rest of the body, because the story in the rest of the body is going to tell you, give you the rest of it. Like, do I have a thyroid issue? Does this person have a thyroid issue? I think they do, but let me go check. Hey, we've got these 6 patterns going on. Probably have a thyroid issue. And the solution, as Kelly said, probably 3 or 4 times during the podcast, is not which thyroid hormone you need, right? And my analogy to that is always, hey, if the car is not running, you need some gas in the car to at least see if it'll start, right? And see if it's running. But if it's not running on 97 octane gas, 98 is probably not going to make it run significantly better, right? So it may be another issue, right? Bacteria, organisms, toxins, heavy metals, mercury, bromide, right? And it's likely not one thing. By the time your thyroid physiology is thyroid gland crashed and you're on thyroid medications, you are so far probably past the one thing concept that you're not going to be able just to say, well, I gave up gluten and it's not better, right?
It's not working.
Right. And I think we talked about the board analogy. Did we talk about that on the last podcast? Did we talk about that?
I don't think I talked about it, but you did talk about it recently. Yeah.
So if you once you put those, 5-pound weights on, you break the board, to get that piece of broken board up, you got to take almost all the weights off the broken board to get the board back up. It's not like, okay, I'll just take the last 5 pound off. There's still 100 or 200 pounds on the broken pieces. You got to get a lot of that stuff off to help rebuild the system. And that's what we're trying to help everybody do. So hopefully this helps. If you have questions, put your questions wherever you watch or download your podcast. If you can always reach out to myself. Probably reach out to Kelly. I'll get a link for her contact information if you have questions. And we're both on Instagram. We're both on, we both have our own websites. But if you have questions, just reach out to wherever you have the podcast. I'll see the questions, and then maybe we'll use those questions as further topics for future Thyroid Answers podcasts. All right, Kelly, any parting comments, thoughts?
No, I thought it was great. And just excited to be sitting in for the lovely Dr. Erica. And I'm going to be around until she has her baby, and then maybe a couple episodes more. So just excited to be working with you, Eric.
Awesome. So we got some good hosts coming up, some good guests coming up. We are the good hosts.
Yes,
good guests coming up, right? So got some good guests coming up in the future episodes. So thanks everybody for listening. Share this with your friends. And when you get a chance, go rate the podcast. I think the right side, the 5-star thing is probably the way to go. Okay. All right. From here, we're out. All right, Kelly, thank you for jumping in, and we'll see you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Bye.